Professor Davies' lecture on naval strategy was fascinating. Indeed, he believes the escalation in the Pacific is inevitable.
Commander, the flight deck is clear. We are ready to engage the enemy fleet.
In the autumn of 1940, Isoroku Yamamoto wrote a letter to Japan's Navy minister that should have stopped the war before it started. The letter was precise, analytical, and correct in every particular that the subsequent history would test. Yamamoto wrote that if Japan went to war with the United States, he could promise vigorous fighting for the first 6 months or a year. After that, he wrote, he had no confidence whatsoever. He knew American industry. He had lived in the United States as a naval attaché, had studied at Harvard, had traveled across the country and seen the oil fields of Texas and the automobile factories of Michigan and the shipyards of the Atlantic coast. He had spent enough time in America to understand what it was capable of when it committed itself to a purpose. Japan's military and political leadership read the letter, acknowledged its arguments, and proceeded with the war anyway. Yamamoto then did something that defines his character with unusual clarity. He planned Pearl Harbor. The man who had written the most accurate prediction of Japan's defeat was also the man who designed the attack that made Japan's defeat inevitable. He did not resign. He did not refuse the assignment. He was a naval officer in a system that had made the decision for war, and his job was to give Japan the best possible chance within constraint of a decision he believed was wrong. He devoted the full force of his considerable genius to designing an attack that would damage American naval power badly enough to give Japan the time it needed, the 6 months to a year that it promised, to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia before the American industrial machine could overwhelm Japanese military power. The attack was brilliant. The execution was almost flawless. The aircraft that swept in over Oahu on the morning of December 7, 1941, sank or damaged 8 American battleships, killed more than 2,400 Americans, and achieved the tactical surprise that Yamamoto's planning had designed for. By any measure of short-term military effectiveness, Pearl Harbor was one of the most successful surprise attacks in the history of naval warfare, and it failed to achieve the one thing that Yamamoto had designed it to achieve. The American aircraft carriers that were his primary targets, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in Pearl Harbor on December 7th. They were at sea on training exercises and logistics missions. The attack that was supposed to destroy American naval power in the Pacific had destroyed the battleships that were already obsolete and had left untouched the carriers that would fight the decisive battles of the Pacific War. Yamamoto had known this was possible. He had insisted, against the initial opposition of the Naval General Staff, that the attack had to strike the carriers as well as the battleships. He had threatened to resign if the operation was not approved as he designed it, and the Naval General Staff had eventually given way. But the design of the operation could not guarantee that the carriers would be present when the attack came, and they were not present, and the tactical achievement of December 7th was purchased at the strategic cost of activating the American industrial machine, the machine Yamamoto had spent years watching, without destroying the naval force that the machine would rebuild and expand. This is the story of Isoroku Yamamoto, the most gifted Japanese naval commander of the Second World War, the man who planned Pearl Harbor and who knew, from the moment the attack was planned, that he had set in motion the destruction of the country he was trying to serve. Before I go further, I want to ask you directly. Subscribe if you haven't already. The next episode in this series is about Albert Speer, the Nazi architect who rebuilt the German war economy and then saved his own life at Nuremberg by telling a story about himself that historians have spent 80 years trying to prove was a lie. That episode is extraordinary, and it will challenge everything you think you know about how the Third Reich actually functioned. Subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss it. And if this episode about the Admiral who told his government the truth and then did the job anyway gives you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps more people find this series. Back to Yamamoto. back to the man who was right about everything and could not stop any of it. The specific human dimension of the intelligence decision that killed Yamamoto, the decision that Nimitz made to intercept his aircraft, which we discussed in the Nimitz episode of this series, deserves examination from Yamamoto's perspective because it completes the specific tragic arc of his story in a way that the purely operational account does not fully capture. The message that American signals intelligence intercepted in April 1943 was, in the Japanese military's assessment of its own security, supposed to be secure. The Japanese have been using the JN-25 cipher for their operational communications throughout the war, and by April 1943, they had updated the cipher enough times that the Japanese Naval General Staff's assessment was that American code breaking had not kept pace with the changes. They were wrong. Nimitz's intelligence staff at Pearl Harbor had maintained their penetration of Japanese naval communications through the cipher changes, and the message describing Yamamoto's inspection tour was decoded with sufficient accuracy to plan the intercept. The specific irony of the intelligence ambush, that the country Yamamoto had most respected and most studied was a country that had best understood his communications, is a dimension of his death that the simple account of the P-38 intercept does not convey. He had spent years at Harvard and in Washington learning about America, and his specific respect for American intelligence, American industrial capacity, and American political determination had been the basis of his most accurate predictions. In the end, it was American intelligence, the specific form of American analytical capability that he had admired without fully understanding, that planned his death. The decision to intercept him was not taken lightly. Nimitz and his intelligence staff understood that acting on the specific JN-25 intelligence about Yamamoto's itinerary carried the risk of revealing that the cipher had been penetrated. Yamamoto's death in circumstances that could only be explained by prior knowledge of his movements might prompt a Japanese investigation that would discover the code breaking and lead to cipher changes that would close the intelligence window. The risk was real and was weighed against the military value of removing Japan's most capable naval commander from the war. The specific calculation that Nimitz made, that the military value of killing Yamamoto outweighed the risk to the intelligence source, was vindicated in its immediate consequences. The Japanese investigation into the Bougainville ambush did not conclusively establish that the cipher had been compromised, partly because the Japanese could not accept that their codes had been broken, and partly because the specific circumstances of the ambush were consistent with other explanations. The intelligence source survived, and the specific advantage that it provided continued to inform American operations throughout the Pacific War. Yamamoto's death had immediate consequences for the Japanese war effort that went beyond the removal of one commander. He had been, by wide agreement within the Japanese naval establishment, the irreplaceable figure whose strategic vision and operational creativity had provided whatever coherence the Japanese naval campaign possessed. His successor, Admiral Manaichi Koga, was a capable officer but not a strategic innovator, and the Japanese naval campaign under Koga's direction lacked the specific quality of operational creativity that Yamamoto had brought. The specific effect of this loss of strategic direction was most visible in the Central Pacific campaign that followed. The American advance through the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and the Marianas that Nimitz launched in late 1943 and 1944. The Japanese response to this advance was reactive and inadequate in ways that reflect the absence of the kind of strategic thinking that Yamamoto had provided. The operations of the Mariana Islands that produced the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the destruction of the Japanese carrier air groups in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, demonstrated both the accumulated power of the American naval machine and the specific inadequacy of the Japanese response. Yamamoto would have recognized the approaching defeat. He had predicted it in 1940 and had watched it develop with the specific clarity of a man who had both planned it and been unable to prevent it. His death spared him the specific knowledge of what came after April 1943. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Fall of Saipan, the Kamikaze Campaign, the firebombing of Japanese cities, the atomic bombs, but the trajectory he had identified in his letter had been confirmed in every particular before he died. The post-war evaluation of his career by American naval historians has been, on the whole, marked by a specific professional respect that the analysis of his Japanese contemporaries and successors has not always shared. The American assessment has emphasized his operational achievements, the carrier doctrine, the Pearl Harbor planning, the specific command qualities of the Pacific War's early phase, while acknowledging the strategic limitations of the situation in which those achievements were deployed. The Japanese assessment has been more complicated, shaped by the specific dynamics of post-war Japanese engagement with the war's memory and by the political uses to which the Yamamoto legend has been put. The honest assessment requires both perspectives and the ability to hold the contradiction that they produce. Yamamoto was the most gifted Japanese naval officer of the war. He was also the author of the attack that started it. He was right about what the war would cost Japan. He was also the man who planned the operation that made the cost inevitable. These things are all true simultaneously, and the historical record that honors the full truth of his career has to hold them in that tension rather than resolving it in either direction. He was not a hero in the simple sense. He was not a villain in the simple sense. He was a specific human being with specific gifts and specific obligations and specific constraints, operating in specific historical circumstances, who made specific choices, and whose specific choices had specific consequences. The consequences were the Pacific War. The Pacific War was what he had predicted. The prediction was right. And the man who made it was ambushed in the jungle because his country had gone to war with the country he had spent years learning to understand. The specific Japanese words, Yamamoto's own assessment of his country's decision to go to war, were these: "I fear we have only awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve." The attribution is disputed by historians. It appears in the 1970 film Tora, but has not been found in any contemporary document. But the sentiment is consistent with everything that Yamamoto actually said and wrote about the war. Whether he said those specific words or not, he believed what they expressed. He was right to believe it. The giant was awakened. The resolve was terrible. And the war that filled the giant with that resolve was the war that Yamamoto had designed and planned and advocated for and commanded and died fighting. That is, the Yamamoto War. The broader question of how Yamamoto should be assessed in the historical record, as a military genius, as a Japanese patriot, as the architect of a war he believed would destroy his country, is one that Japanese and Western historians have approached from different angles and with different conclusions. In Japan, Yamamoto's legacy has been shaped by the specific dynamics of post-war Japanese memory of the war, a memory that has had to navigate between the nationalist traditions that honor the war's military commanders and the democratic and pacifist values that the post-war constitution enshrined. The specific figure of Yamamoto, the commander who opposed the war, who predicted defeat, who nevertheless fought with everything he had, has made him available for a range of interpretations that other Japanese military figures are not capable of supporting. The 2011 Japanese biographical film Admiral Yamamoto and the earlier 1968 film about Pearl Harbor both portrayed him as a tragic figure, a man of genuine wisdom and genuine humanity who was trapped by the specific institutional and political dynamics of the military system he served. This narrative has resonance in Japan because it allows the acknowledgement of the war's strategic errors without the full confrontation with Japanese military aggression that a less sympathetically presented figure would require. The American historical assessment has been more varied. Military historians tend to treat Yamamoto with professional respect for his operational achievements, the carrier doctrine he developed, the Pearl Harbor planning, the specific tactics of the Pacific War's early phase, while maintaining clear-eyed assessment of the strategic consequences. The fact that he opposed the war is acknowledged, but it is not allowed to obscure the fact that he fought it effectively. The specific ambiguity of Yamamoto's moral position, the man who opposed the war but fought it, who predicted Japan's defeat but planned the attack that made the defeat inevitable, is one that the historical scholarship has been more willing to acknowledge than either the Japanese nationalist narrative or the straightforward Allied victory narrative. The full account of Yamamoto requires holding the warning and the attack in the same frame, acknowledging both the insight and the execution, and refusing the simplification that makes him simply a tragic hero or simply a war criminal. He was neither. He was a gifted military officer who served a government that made a catastrophically wrong decision, who told that government the truth about the decision, who was overruled, and who then devoted his talent to fighting the war as effectively as possible within constraints of the decision that had been made over his objections. The morality of this position is not simple, and the historical record does not resolve it simply. What the record does establish is the quality of his insight, His 1940 letter to the Navy minister was not simply prescient. It was analytically precise in ways that the subsequent history confirmed in every particular. The American industrial capacity he had identified would produce exactly the overwhelming material superiority that he had predicted. The American political will that he had assessed as too strong to be broken by a single military blow was exactly as strong as he had assessed. The 6 months to a year of vigorous fighting that it promised was exactly what the Japanese war effort achieved before the tide turned decisively. He was right, in the full historical record, across the specific dimensions of the prediction he made: industrial capacity, political will, the timeline of Japanese effective resistance. He was more accurate than any other senior figure in the Japanese military or political establishment who addressed these questions. The tragedy of the Pacific War's Japanese side is not simply that Japan lost. It is that the person who most clearly understood why Japan would lose was the person most responsible for how Japan fought. The specific relationship between Yamamoto's role in starting the war and his role in fighting, it is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of his legacy, and it deserves direct acknowledgement. Pearl Harbor killed 2,400 Americans and set in motion a war that killed millions. The specific attack that Yamamoto designed and planned and advocated for was the act that transformed the Pacific War from a regional conflict into a global one, that committed the United States to the total war effort that his letter had predicted it would commit to. His genius was in service of catastrophe, whatever his private reservations about the decision that produced it. The Americans who died at Pearl Harbor did not know that the Admiral who had planned their deaths had spent years arguing against the war that produced them. The families of the men who died on the battleships in the harbor and on the airfields that were attacked and in the various installations that December 7th struck did not know that the Japanese naval officer most responsible for the attack had written, more than a year before, that attacking America would destroy Japan. They knew only the attack and the deaths and the specific shock of what December 7th meant for American life and American security. The historical accounting of Yamamoto's career has to hold all of these dimensions simultaneously: his insight, his execution, the tragedy of his position, and the specific cost of what his talent was used to accomplish. The tragedy is real. The cost is also real. The historical record requires acknowledging both without allowing either to face the other. He was, in the end, a man of extraordinary talent in service of a wrong cause, who told the truth about the cause and then served it anyway, and whose talent in service of the wrong cause produced exactly the outcomes he had predicted the wrong cause would produce. The war was lost before he was killed. The Navy he had built was destroyed before he died. The prediction he had made in 1940 was confirmed in every particular by the time the P-38s intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville. He saw it coming. He said so. He did it anyway. He was right. And the war happened as he said it would. And the country was destroyed as he said it would be. And the man who had told the truth about both of these things was ambushed in the jungle in the Pacific before he had to see the ending he had predicted. That is the Yamamoto War. The specific operational planning of the Pearl Harbor attack, the technical and tactical problem that Yamamoto solved in the months between his authorization of the operation and its execution on December 7, 1941, is worth examining in some detail because it reveals both the specific quality of his military mind and the specific constraints within which that mind was working. The primary tactical problem of the Pearl Harbor attack was the depth of the harbor. Pearl Harbor was, by the standards of naval torpedo bombing, extremely shallow. The water was too shallow for conventional aerial torpedoes, which needed significant depth to arm and level off after being dropped from aircraft. The specific weapons technology available to the Japanese Naval Air Force in 1941 was not designed for shallow water operations, and the Naval General Staff's initial assessment had been that aerial torpedo attack on ships in Pearl Harbor was technically impossible. Yamamoto tasked his aviation staff to solve the problem. The solution they developed: modified torpedoes with wooden fins that prevented them from diving too deep after release, was a specific piece of engineering innovation that made Pearl Harbor possible. The testing of the modified torpedoes in Kagoshima Bay, which has similar characteristics to Pearl Harbor's harbor depth, demonstrated that the technical problem had been solved. The second major tactical problem was the risk of the approaching carrier fleet being detected before it reached its launch position. The standard shipping routes across the North Pacific were patrolled by American and Japanese commercial shipping, and a force of 6 carriers with their escorts will be visible to anyone who saw them. Yamamoto's solution was to route the force along the northern Pacific track, through some of the most inhospitable ocean in the world, avoiding the standard shipping lanes entirely. The force maintained strict radio silence throughout the approach, and the weather in the northern Pacific in late November and early December, storms, heavy seas, low visibility, provided natural cover that the force used to its advantage. The third problem was coordination. The attack required the simultaneous arrival of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and high-level bombers from multiple carrier decks, timed to achieve maximum confusion in the American defenses before any effective response could be mounted. The specific coordination of this multi-axis attack, the timing, the approach routes, the target assignments, was worked out in exhaustive detail in the months of planning that preceded the operation. The specific precision with which the attack was executed on December 7th reflected the specific quality of the planning that had preceded it. Yamamoto himself was not present for the attack. He remained aboard his flagship Nagato in Japanese waters, monitoring the situation through radio communications from the strike force. The specific choice to remain in Japan rather than accompany the strike force was partly operational. His presence with the fleet would not have changed what the carrier pilots did, and partly a reflection of his ambivalence about the operation. He had designed it, advocated for it against institutional opposition, and he was responsible for its execution, but he did not celebrate it. The account of his behavior when the initial reports of success came and described a man who received the news with quiet relief rather than visible satisfaction. The initial reports were genuinely successful. The attack had achieved its tactical objectives almost completely. The battleships were sunk or damaged. The air bases were suppressed. The American Pacific Fleet's battle line had been destroyed. The specific military achievement was real, and it was Yamamoto's achievement in the sense that his planning had made it possible. The missing carriers were the specific thing he had known might happen, and that had happened anyway. The account of his reaction to the news that the American carriers had not been in port described a man who absorbed the information with the specific composure of someone who has been told something he had feared but had not been able to prevent. He knew what the missing carriers meant. They meant that the decisive blow that Pearl Harbor was supposed to deliver had not been delivered. They meant that the American carrier force was intact and would be available to fight the battles of the next 6 months. They meant that the specific strategic objective of the attack, to buy Japan enough time to consolidate its Southeast Asian conquest before American industrial power could be brought to bear, might not be achievable on the timeline that the Japanese planning had assumed. He was right about this too. The American carriers that were not at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, were the carriers that fought at Coral Sea and Midway and Guadalcanal. They were the carriers that stopped the Japanese advance, turned the strategic tide at Midway, and sustained American naval presence in the Solomons through the grinding Guadalcanal campaign. The specific absence of those ships from Pearl Harbor was the single most consequential tactical failure of the Pacific War's opening, and it was a failure that Yamamoto had known was possible and that he could not prevent once the decision was made to proceed without guaranteeing their presence. The specific relationship between Yamamoto's genius and the constraints of the institutional system within which he was operating is the central tension of his story, and it runs through every phase of his Pacific War command. He was, by common consensus of the military historians who have studied the Pacific War, the most operationally gifted Japanese naval commander of the conflict, more creative, more strategically sophisticated, more aware of the full dimensions of the situation than any of his contemporaries in the Japanese naval establishment. He was also a commander who was operating within an institutional framework that constrained his strategic freedom in specific ways that his personal gifts could not overcome. The Japanese military establishment of the 1930s and 1940s was shaped by specific institutional dynamics that rewarded aggression and punished what the system called defeatism. Officers who identified strategic limitations, who calculated that Japan's material position made specific objectives unreachable, who argued for restraint or accommodation, were not simply overruled. They were institutionally damaged by the position they had taken. The specific culture of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy was one in which the admission of weakness was itself a kind of failure, in which the willingness to tell the truth about Japan's strategic position was indistinguishable within the institutional framework from the absence of the fighting spirit that the system valued above all. Yamamoto had told the truth, and he had survived telling it, partly because of his personal standing, partly because of the specific way he had framed his warning as a professional assessment rather than a political position, and partly because the decision for war had been made by political and military leaders who were not primarily naval officers, and whose institutional culture was somewhat different from the naval establishments. After Pearl Harbor, the institutional dynamics that had shaped the decision for war continued to shape the strategic planning that followed. The specific Japanese military culture that had led to Pearl Harbor, the tendency to design operations around optimal scenarios, the reluctance to plan for failure, the specific aggression that mistook boldness for strategic intelligence, continued to produce operations whose ambition exceeded the resources available to execute them. Midway was the most consequential example. The operation that was supposed to draw the American carriers out and destroy them was itself drawn into an ambush by the code-breaking capability that Yamamoto had no way of knowing existed. After Midway, the constraints became more severe in specific ways that compounded each other. The loss of the experienced carrier air groups was a particularly damaging dimension of the Midway defeat. The ships could be replaced, new carriers were being built, and would enter service as the war continued. The pilots could not be replaced on the same timeline. The Japanese Naval Aviation Training Program had been designed to produce a small number of highly skilled aviators over long periods of training, rather than the larger numbers of adequately skilled aviators that a long war would require. The specific men who had flown at Pearl Harbor and at Coral Sea, and who had died at Midway, represented years of training investment that the Japanese system could not quickly replicate. Yamamoto understood this dimension of the Midway defeat as well. He had built his strategy around the specific quality of Japanese naval aviation, the specific superiority of the pilots that the training system had produced, and Midway had destroyed that superiority in a single morning. The pilots who replaced the Midway dead were less experienced, less skilled, and less capable of the specific precision that the Japanese carrier doctrine required. The specific aerial capability that had made Pearl Harbor possible and that had carried Japanese forces to the first 6 months of the Pacific War had been fundamentally degraded. The Guadalcanal campaign that followed Midway was, in many ways, a sustained demonstration of this degradation. Yamamoto committed his forces to the support of the Guadalcanal garrison with the specific intensity that the strategic importance of the island required. The naval battles that resulted, Cape Esperance, Santa Cruz, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, inflicted casualties on both sides, but on the Japanese in ways they could not afford. Each battle consumed pilots and air crews that were less replaceable than the ones before. By the time of his death in April 1943, Yamamoto was commanding a naval air force whose specific quality advantage over the Americans had been significantly eroded. The American training system, producing more pilots more quickly, if not at the same individual skill level as the pre-war Japanese pilots, was closing the gap that the initial Japanese advantage had established. The industrial production advantage that Yamamoto had identified in his 1940 letter was expressing itself in the replacement rates for ships and aircraft that the Japanese production system could not match. He died before he could see the full consequences of the strategic situation he had helped create. He died in a jungle in the Solomons, ambushed by the intelligence service of the country he had spent years learning to respect, in a war he had predicted and opposed, and then conducted with everything he had. The specific tragedy of his death, the intelligence ambush, the country that killed him being the same country he had spent years at Harvard learning to respect, is the appropriate ending for a story of this kind. He had done everything his talent and his institutional obligations required of him. He had planned the attack that started the war. He had commanded the Navy through the first year of the war. He had lost Midway. He had failed to hold Guadalcanal. And he had died in an ambush that the code breaking that he had no way of knowing existed had arranged. The war he had predicted continued for another 2 years. It ended as he had said it would end, with Japan's defeat, with the destruction of the Navy he had built, with the occupation of the country he had tried to serve. The atomic bombs that ended the war were dropped on cities that he had never seen, in a war that his letter had tried to prevent. He saw it coming. He said so. He did it anyway. He was right. The war happened as he predicted. The country was destroyed as he predicted. And he died in the jungle before he had to see it. That is the full accounting of the Yamamoto War. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 in Nagaoka, a city in Niigata Prefecture that had been on the losing side of the Boshin War, the civil war that had ended the Tokugawa shogunate and established the Meiji imperial government. Nagaoka was a city of samurai tradition and institutional defeat, and the specific ethos of the city, the acceptance of obligation, and the facing of consequences with composure, was part of what Yamamoto carried throughout his life. He had been adopted by the Yamamoto family as a young man, taken the family name in the process, and had entered the Naval Academy as a young man in a country that was still defining itself as a modern nation-state. His early career had coincided with the flowering of Japanese naval ambition, the naval victory over Russia at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, which he had participated in as a young midshipman, losing 2 fingers on his left hand to a shell burst. Tsushima had demonstrated that Japan could defeat a European great power in naval combat, and had profoundly shaped the Japanese naval establishment's understanding of what was possible. The lesson that the Naval General Staff took from Tsushima, that a decisive naval engagement, fought with superior tactics and superior gunnery, could destroy an enemy fleet and win a war, became the foundational doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yamamoto had taken a different lesson. He had seen the limits of what naval gunfire could accomplish in an era when air power was transforming warfare, and he had spent the interwar years as one of the strongest advocates for naval aviation within the Japanese naval establishment. He had commanded carriers and had trained aviators and had developed the operational doctrine that would eventually make the Japanese carrier force of 1941 the most effective naval aviation force in the world. The specific tactical innovations of Pearl Harbor, the mass carrier strike, the coordinated attack by torpedo bombers and dive bombers and high-level bombers, reflected the operational thinking that Yamamoto had been developing and refining for years. He had also spent time in America that no other senior Japanese naval officer had matched. His 2 years as a naval attaché in Washington in the 1920s, followed by studies at Harvard, had given him a specific understanding of American industrial capacity and American political culture that was almost entirely absent from the Japanese military and political leadership that would make the decisions leading to war. He spoke English. He had American friends. He had driven across the American West and had seen, with his own eyes, the scale of what the American economy could produce. This specific knowledge was the foundation of the warning he wrote to Japan's Navy minister in 1940, and it was a foundation of his consistent opposition to the war with the United States that the Japanese military was planning. His opposition was not simply strategic. It was personal. He liked America. He had experienced American hospitality and American directness in ways that had given him genuine affection for the country he was predicting Japan would eventually fight. The specific tragedy of his position, the man who liked America, who understood America, who knew what war with America would cost, planning the attack on America, is one of the more painful ironies in the history of the Pacific War. His opposition to the war was expressed through the institutional channels available to him, the letters to the Navy minister, the private communications with civilian politicians who shared his concerns, the specific arguments he made in internal discussions about Japan's strategic situation. It was not expressed through resignation or public dissent. Yamamoto was a naval officer of the Japanese Empire, shaped by the specific ethos of service and obligation that the Meiji system had instilled in its military class. Public dissent against a policy decision was not an option that his conception of his role made available to him. The decision for war was made by political and military leaders who were either convinced by their own optimism, trapped by the specific dynamics of Japanese institutional politics in which admitting strategic weakness was career-ending, or genuinely calculating that the risk of inaction was greater than the risk of war. The specific Japanese assessment that the United States would negotiate a settlement after a devastating initial blow rather than committing to a long war of attrition was wrong, but it was not irrational given the specific political calculations of 1941. Yamamoto knew it was wrong. He had watched the American response to events in Europe too carefully to believe that the political will for a negotiated peace with Japan would survive a major attack on American forces. He had read enough American newspapers and enough American political culture to understand that Pearl Harbor would produce in American public opinion the specific reaction that Franklin Roosevelt was simultaneously hoping for and dreading, the transformation of a reluctant nation into a nation committed to total war. He was right about this too. Roosevelt addressed the Congress on December 8th, the day of infamy speech. The speech that asked for and received the declaration of war that the isolationist Congress had been refusing was a specific political consequence that Yamamoto had predicted. The sleeping giant had been awakened, as the phrase that was attributed to him, possibly apocryphally, expressed it. The industrial machine had been engaged. The war that Yamamoto had promised vigorous fighting in for 6 months or a year had begun. The first 6 months went roughly as Yamamoto had predicted. The Japanese advanced through Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, was swift and nearly complete. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated with a confidence and a capability that the pre-war assessments of the Western Allies had not anticipated. The Zero fighter was superior to anything the Allies could put against it in the early months of the war. The Japanese carrier pilots were the best trained naval aviators in the world. The naval tactics that Yamamoto had helped develop were applied with the specific precision that intensive training made possible. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the first naval battle in history in which the opposing fleets never came within sight of each other, fought entirely by carrier aircraft, checked the Japanese advance toward Australia and Port Moresby. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but removed 2 Japanese carriers from a midway operation that Yamamoto was planning, and it demonstrated that the American carrier force was capable of fighting the Japanese carrier force on approximately equal terms. Midway, which we are told in detail in the Nimitz episode of the series, was a battle that ended the phase of Japanese naval dominance that Yamamoto had planned and that Pearl Harbor had initiated. The loss of 4 fleet carriers at Midway, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the core of the strike force that Yamamoto had built over years, was a blow from which Japanese naval aviation never recovered. Yamamoto had designed Midway as a decisive battle that would destroy what remained of American naval power in the Pacific. Instead, it became the battle that destroyed the offensive capability of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yamamoto's response to Midway was, by the account of those who served with him, one of deep personal anguish combined with the specific composure of a man who had known this was possible. He had built the force. He had designed the operations. He had committed Japan to a strategy that the loss of 4 carriers at Midway had made significantly less viable. He could not acknowledge in any public or institutional way the scale of what Midway meant. The specific dynamics of the Japanese military establishment made acknowledging strategic defeat an institutional impossibility. He continued to plan and to command. The Guadalcanal campaign of 1942 to 43 was the next major test of his command, and was a test that extended over months of grinding naval attrition in the waters around the contested island. Yamamoto committed his forces repeatedly to the support of the Guadalcanal garrison, fighting a series of naval engagements in Iron Bottom Sound that inflicted significant casualties on both sides, but that the Japanese could afford less than the Americans. The specific asymmetry that he had identified in his letter to the Navy minister, the American capacity to replace losses that Japan could not match, was visible in the Guadalcanal campaign in exactly the way he had predicted. He understood what Guadalcanal's eventual outcome would mean. By the time the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, the strategic situation that Yamamoto had foreseen in 1940 was becoming visible to the entire Japanese military establishment. The 6 months to a year had passed. The American industrial machine was producing ships and aircraft and trained personnel at rates that Japanese production could not approach. The specific initiative that Pearl Harbor had given Japan, the 6 months of freedom to consolidate its conquests, was exhausted, and what replaced it was a long attrition that Yamamoto had known Japan could not survive. In April 1943, Yamamoto planned a major aerial offensive over the Solomon Islands, Operation Igo, designed to destroy American air power in the region and regain the local air superiority that the Japanese had lost. The operation was moderately successful in its immediate tactical results, but did not achieve the decisive effect that Yamamoto needed. After its conclusion, he planned an inspection tour of the forward bases in the Solomons to boost morale and assess the situation personally. American signals intelligence, the same code-breaking capability that had informed Nimitz at Midway, intercepted the detailed itinerary of Yamamoto's tour. The message described his departure time, his arrival times at each base, the specific aircraft he would be traveling in, and the fighter escort that would accompany him. The message was specific enough to plan an interception. Nimitz made the decision we discussed in the Nimitz episode. He ordered the intercept. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 American P-38 fighters flying from Guadalcanal at the extreme range of their aircraft intercepted the Japanese formation over Bougainville. Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down. His body was found in the jungle the following day, still strapped to his seat, the marks of bullet wounds on him. He was 59 years old. The Japanese government announced his death to the Japanese public on May 21st, after constructing the fiction that he had died in combat at the front rather than in the specific ambush that American intelligence had arranged. He was given a state funeral. He was posthumously promoted to Fleet Admiral. He was declared a national hero. The irony of the posthumous heroism was complete. The man who had spent years telling his government that war with America would destroy Japan was honored as one of the war's greatest heroes by the country that his honesty had failed to save. The war he had predicted Japan would lose continued for another 2 years after his death, killing millions of people on both sides, ended with the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the surrender ceremony on the deck of the Missouri that we discussed at the end of the Pacific War episodes of the series. He was right about everything and could stop none of it. He planned the attack that was supposed to give Japan time, and instead gave America purpose. He commanded the Navy that he had built into the finest in the world, and watched it be destroyed at Midway. He tried to hold what Pearl Harbor had bought through the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal and failed. He died in a jungle in the Solomons, ambushed by the intelligence service of the country. He had spent years at Harvard learning to respect and fear. The specific quality of Yamamoto's tragedy, the quality that makes him one of the most compelling figures in the entire history of the Second World War, is the combination of clear vision and constrained action. He saw what was coming. He said what he saw. He was overruled. And then he devoted his life and his talent to the service of a policy he knew was wrong, because the alternative, to refuse, to resign, to refuse the institutional obligation of a naval officer, was not available to the man he had shaped himself to be. This is not a defense of what he did. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,400 Americans, started a war that killed millions, and set in motion the specific chain of events that ended with the atomic bombs and the incineration of Japanese cities. Yamamoto's genius was in service of those outcomes, whatever his private reservations. The letter he wrote to the Navy minister does not undo the attack on Pearl Harbor. His personal tragedy does not diminish the tragedy he helped produce. What it does is add a dimension to the Pacific War story that the straightforward narrative of Allied victory and Japanese aggression does not always provide. The dimension of the specific human beings on the Japanese side who understood what they were doing and did it anyway, whose tragedy was personal as well as historical, and whose specific combination of insight and obligation produced the specific outcomes that the war required. He saw it coming. He said so. He did it anyway. He was right, and the war he predicted happened exactly as he said it would. That is the Yamamoto War. The admiral who told the truth, planned a lie, and was ambushed by the country he had spent years at Harvard learning to respect. The specific question of what Yamamoto's career tells us about the relationship between military genius and political failure, between the ability to see clearly and the inability to act on what is seen, is one of the broader themes that his story illuminates with particular force. Military history is full of commanders who made strategic errors of judgment, who failed to see what their situation required, who persisted in failed strategies, who misread the operational situation and paid the consequences. Yamamoto represents a different kind of failure, and in some ways a more interesting one. The commander who saw correctly and could not act on what he saw, who was constrained by the institutional and political framework of the system, he served from translating accurate strategic insight into effective strategic action. This failure has specific antecedents in the broader history of the Second World War that are worth noting. Rommel, whose story we have told in an earlier episode of this series, was another commander who saw the situation clearly, who told Hitler and the German command that the Normandy landing could not be repelled unless the panzers were at the beach, who was overruled and then absent from his headquarters when the landing came, and who was also constrained from acting fully on what he saw. The pattern of the clearly seeing commander overruled by the decision-making system above him is one of the recurring features of the Second World War on both sides. The specific difference between Rommel and Yamamoto is the scale of the strategic insight and the scale of the constraint. Rommel was arguing about the deployment of specific armor reserves for a specific defensive operation. Yamamoto was arguing about whether Japan should go to war with the United States at all. The stakes of Yamamoto's insight were larger, the constraint on acting on it more complete, and the consequences of the institutional overruling more catastrophic. The Japanese military-political system of the 1930s and 1940s had specific structural features that made it particularly resistant to the kind of honest strategic assessment that Yamamoto was trying to provide. The specific relationship between the military and the political leadership, in which the military had a constitutional right to bring down the government by withdrawing its ministers, which gave military factions enormous leverage over civilian political decision-making, created conditions in which the civilian politicians who might have imposed strategic restraint on the military had insufficient institutional power to do so. The specific dynamics of the Japanese military's internal culture, in which the advocates of aggressive expansion had been systematically more successful in career advancement than the advocates of restraint, had produced, by the late 1930s, a senior military leadership that was heavily weighted toward the expansionist position. The specific officers who had most clearly articulated the risks of expansion had been marginalized or had learned to keep their views private. Yamamoto's willingness to express his views directly and publicly, to write to the Navy minister and to tell civilian politicians what he thought, was itself a departure from the institutional norm, and the survival of his career and his position despite this departure reflected his specific institutional standing and his specific personal reputation. The failure to translate Yamamoto's strategic insight into strategic policy was not a failure of the insight. It was a failure of the system, the specific institutional and political system of Imperial Japan in 1941, to incorporate accurate strategic information into its decision-making process in a way that could override the political and institutional momentum toward war. The specific momentum came from many sources. The Army's specific investments in the China campaign that a settlement with the United States might threaten, the specific oil embargo that American policy had imposed, and that Japanese calculations presented as an existential threat requiring a response. The specific institutional dynamics of a military establishment that had been preparing for a Pacific War for 20 years, and that could not easily reverse that preparation without institutional damage against these forces. Yamamoto's letter and his private communications and his specific arguments were insufficient. He was one voice, however distinguished, arguing against a momentum that had been building for years. His argument was correct. The momentum was stronger than the argument. This is a specific tragedy of the Yamamoto story. Not the ambush, not the death in the jungle, but a specific institutional failure that turned a correct strategic assessment into a futile warning. He told the truth. He was not believed, or he was believed and overruled, and either way the outcome was the same. The war happened. Japan was destroyed. The prediction was confirmed, and the man who had made the prediction was dead before the destruction he had predicted was complete. The sleeping giant was awakened. Yamamoto had known it would be. The terrible resolve filled the giant as he had said it would, and the Admiral who predicted it all died in a jungle in the Pacific, ambushed by the intelligence service of the country he had spent years at Harvard learning to respect and fear. He saw it coming. He said so. He could not stop it. He fought it anyway. He was right. That is the Yamamoto War. That is the full accounting of what it means to see clearly in a system that cannot hear what you see. The specific memory of Yamamoto in the countries most directly affected by the Pacific War, Japan, the United States, and the Philippines, reflects the different relationships each country has to the war's history and to the specific figure of the man who planned its most famous opening act. In Japan, Yamamoto has been the subject of sustained commemorative attention, films, biographies, museum exhibitions, and the specific preservation of the sites associated with his life and death. The city of Nagaoka, where he was born, maintains a museum dedicated to his memory that attracts visitors from across Japan. His family home has been preserved. The specific artifact of his life, the chess set he used, the letters he wrote, the personal effects recovered from the jungle near Bougainville, are preserved and exhibited with the care that a national hero's possessions receive. The specific narrative through which the Japanese commemoration presents Yamamoto is a tragedy narrative. The man who opposed the war, who predicted defeat, who nevertheless served his country with everything he had. This narrative has political utility in post-war Japan because it provides a figure who can be honored without endorsing the war's aggression. The commemoration of Yamamoto can coexist with the democratic and pacifist values of post-war Japan in ways that the commemoration of the generals who planned and executed the atrocities of the China campaign cannot. The tension in this narrative between the man who opposed the war and the man who fought it is generally handled by emphasizing the former and contextualizing the latter. The Pearl Harbor planning is presented as a consequence of his institutional obligation rather than his personal choice. The attacks on American forces throughout the Pacific War are presented as a professional duty of a naval officer serving his country rather than as the product of aggressive military ambition. This narrative is not entirely wrong. The institutional obligation was real. The distinction between Yamamoto's personal views and his professional conduct is a real distinction that the historical record supports. But it simplifies the full truth of his situation in ways that allow the Japanese commemoration to be more comfortable than the full historical account warrants. The American perspective on Yamamoto has been shaped by a different set of considerations. The direct experience of Pearl Harbor, the specific shock of the attack, the deaths, the damage, has made the American memory of Yamamoto more complex than the simple professional respect that some military historians express. The popular American awareness of Yamamoto tends to focus on the specific ambush of April 1943 as a satisfying narrative conclusion. The genius who planned Pearl Harbor killed by American intelligence, rather than on the tragic dimensions of a story that the Japanese commemoration emphasizes. Both perspectives are partial. The full truth of Yamamoto requires the insight and the execution, the warning and the attack, the professional respect and the acknowledgement of what the professional service accomplished. It requires acknowledging that the man who predicted Japan's defeat was the man who designed the attack that made Japan's defeat inevitable, and that these two facts about the same person exist in a tension that does not resolve into either a simple hero or a simple villain. He was a gifted naval officer. He was wrong to plan Pearl Harbor, regardless of his institutional obligations. He was right about what the war would cost Japan. He was killed by the country he had spent years learning to understand. He was honored by the country his attack had killed 2,400 of. He died before the ending he had predicted was complete. That is the full accounting. That is who Yamamoto was. That is the Yamamoto War. The admiral who told the truth was overruled. The admiral who fought the war was killed. The war happened as he predicted. Japan was destroyed as he predicted. The giant was awakened as he predicted. The terrible resolve filled the giant as he predicted. And Yamamoto died in a jungle in the Pacific before he had to see the atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the country. He had tried to say surrender to the country he had attacked. He saw it coming. He said so. He was right. And the war, his war, the war he designed and fought and died fighting, ended exactly as he had said it would end. That is the Yamamoto War. The atomic bomb was not a weapon that any military planner of 1940 had anticipated. But the essential prediction was right. The American industrial capacity Yamamoto had identified produced by 1945, the weapon that ended the war in a single week. The American political will he had assessed sustained the war effort through 4 years until the will to fight was no longer necessary. He had seen the shape of what would happen. He had not seen the specific weapon. The essential outcome was exactly as he had predicted. That is the final accounting of what it means to see clearly. He saw the shape of the future. He fought to change it and failed. The future arrived in the shape he had predicted, and Yamamoto died in 1943. 2 years before the ending he had predicted was confirmed, having been right about everything and having been able to stop none of it. The sleeping giant awoke. The terrible resolve filled him. Japan was destroyed. He saw it coming. He said so. That is the Yamamoto War.